So you want to be a beekeeper. That's good. That's real good. Now, a lot of folks say that beekeeping is the new chicken keeping, but let me tell you, there's a lot more to learn with beekeeping than there is chicken keeping, people. Beekeeping is kind of part science, part art, part luck. There's a lot of things involved with beekeeping, and it can get pretty complicated. I've been a beekeeper for about 6 years. I think this is my 6th or 7th summer. And I started out with a few hives. Now in the summer, I usually have about 10 hives going. I'm still a small-time keeper, but I'm making money beekeeping. Made about $2,500 last summer. And I just really enjoy it. So my channel here, Whistle Thicket, is not a beekeeping channel, but I definitely got over 100 videos on beekeeping. So feel free to check that out. Tom here, in case you've never met me on YouTube before. So I'm going to share with you at least 10 things I think you should do before you become a beekeeper to kind of get prepared, to get some good knowledge, and to just get ready. Because I'll tell you this, beekeeping is an adventure. It's addicting. And if you do it right, you're going to get a lot of enjoyment. There's going to be some struggles. There's going to be a roller coaster. But in the end, most people that start beekeeping and stick with it, you got to stick with beekeeping at least 2 years. You don't want to give up after your first season if you fail, because really you're not failing. You're just learning. And you don't want to quit. You want to give it at least 2 good solid seasons, maybe even really 3. Because you're going to invest a lot of money, a lot of time. You're going to have a lot of knowledge gain. And after your first or second season, you're going to be more prepared for any beekeeping problems you may encounter. So let's go ahead and talk about some of these tips that I think you should do before you decide to be a beekeeper. First and foremost, before you get into beekeeping, you got to make sure that it's allowed to keep bees wherever you're living. Most places, if you're out in the country, you're probably good, you're golden. But I don't know, some of these city beekeepers probably got to be a little more careful. Maybe you got a homeowners association. Is that what those are called? HOAs? I don't know. I live in the country, people. But I tell you what, you don't want to invest into beekeeping if for some reason you're not allowed to be a beekeeper, like maybe there's a city ordinance or something. I know with chicken keeping, there's a lot of cities where they won't let you keep chickens, or if they will let you keep chickens, you can't keep roosters. I don't know if there's similar things like that with beekeeping, but you really want to double check and make sure. You don't want to get too excited if you're not in the right place to be a beekeeper. Now, if you're a city beekeeper, you can be super successful. People do it all the time. You just got to look into things a little bit more. I was hanging out with some of the animals. Here's some of our goats and pigs in the background probably. So if you figure out that, hey, you got to go for beekeeping as far as where you live, then, whoop, goats and pigs are being a little ornery back there. Then if you are allowed to be a beekeeper, what you should do next is kind of check out your local area. Actually get in the car, people. Drive around for about a 2 to 3 mile radius. You can get on Google Maps, make an aerial view of your property, and sketch out about 2 to 3 miles away from your house, because that is where your bees are going to be foraging, okay? Bees don't typically forage really close to home. They do a little bit, but they have a wide range of area where they will forage. Some people even say it's a little more than 3 miles, but 2 to 3 miles is about the limit of most bees. This is what you want to look for. First, you want to look for other beekeepers, because those beekeepers are going to have bees that are going to be interacting with your bees. If you feel comfortable, you can knock on their door, talk to them. Because that's another thing I'm going to suggest is look for local beekeepers in your area, because beekeeping is different in every area due to climate, geography, the types of plants that are there. So meeting another beekeeper is a great way to start your beekeeping journey. You don't have to beekeep like those folks, but it's a good base. It's a good start. And then you can learn on your own throughout the years. Finding a local beekeeping club, that's also a great idea, just to get that first connection with other beekeepers. They're usually a great source of knowledge. They can share their successes and failures with you. And then sometimes they even have old gear they'll share with you, or maybe give you some old gear, equipment, things like that. So connecting with an old beekeeper or a beekeeper in your area is a great thing to do. But when you're driving around, you may find another beekeeper to connect with. But you also want to look for if there's any major agriculture in your area. What are those people growing? What kind of crops are they growing? Because your bees may be foraging their crops, right? If you can figure it out, you want to see, is that farmer using pesticides? Unfortunately, they probably are. Those pesticides can kill your bees, affect your bees in several ways. You also want to look for any other surprise nectar sources. Maybe there's, I don't know, a community garden, or maybe there's a botanical gardens in your area, anything like that. You also want to look for swimming pools and neighbors. Just because you got some swimming pools close to you doesn't mean you can't be a beekeeper. But what I've read, I don't have any swimming pools around me in the mountains of Western North Carolina where it's a problem. But what I've read is that a lot of folks who have neighbors with swimming pools, your bees will tend to go to those swimming pools to get water. They just like that chlorine water. Sometimes that can make for an upset neighbor. So, you know, something to think about. Doesn't mean you can't be a beekeeper. But just driving around, seeing what's in your area, just get a lay of the land. That can be helpful to kind of see, okay, this is where my bees are going to be foraging, and these are some things to think about. You also want to start learning your nectar sources in your area, because every area has their own unique honey sources or nectar sources that bees turn into honey, and that is going to be your honey variety probably. So like Florida, right? Florida is famous for orange blossom honey. In my area, I'm lucky to be in a small area in America that has sourwood honey. Sourwood honey is one of the most valued honeys in America. People love sourwood, and I live smack dab in the middle of sourwood trees, okay? So I'm really lucky in that regard. But I also know all of the other trees in my area that my bees are foraging. In the next couple of weeks, my bees, which are dormant right now, are going to be out foraging for the first nectar flow of my area. That's willow trees and maple trees. I don't harvest willow and maple honey really, but that gives them their nectar source to get into high gear. So as you're learning about the nectar sources in your area, a lot of people like to focus on flowers. Flowers in some areas, that can be the main nectar source. But where I live, it's really trees are where my bees are getting a lot of their nectar sources early on and in the middle of the season, right? Come spring and summer, there's lots of other ground flowers. In the fall, after sourwood in my area, it is mainly ground flowers from September to October. For me, that's mainly asters and goldenrod. But figuring out what your nectar sources are and when they bloom is really important. That's going to help you figure out timing and when you can harvest, what kind of honey you'll be harvesting, because people like to know what kind of honey they're getting. For me, my first harvest is in June, and I just call that wildflower honey because there's a lot of nectar sources. Then in August, I get sourwood, and sometimes I get a small harvest in the fall, and that's usually goldenrod honey. Okay, so once you've looked into this, you want to figure out where should you put your bees. And now I know my bee yard looks a little humble, and it is. It's just a simple bee yard. I started out with a few hives. Now I normally, like I said, I have about 10 hives in the summer. This is my little bee yard. It's fenced in. Eventually I'm going to put a 6-foot gate here, hopefully this spring. It has room to grow. I don't have an electric fence, actually. A lot of people may be surprised by that. But I do have electric fences on my property for the goats and the horses. I also got 3 dogs that are always roaming around. I've lived on this farm for 10 years. Never seen a bear. Mainly because we got a lot of hunters. And just don't see any bears, unfortunately. Now, if I did have a bear problem, probably the very next day I'd have to go get a bear fence. But for me, I just don't have that problem. So where do you want to put your bee yard? You want to put it somewhere accessible that you're going to be able to check on your bees. You don't want it too close to your house. You don't want it too close to other animals, to a place where your kids play. But you want it accessible. You don't want to make the mistake where you put your bees up against a wall, because you're standing behind your hives to open them up, to inspect them. You want to have plenty of room. You don't want to be in a tight quarter area. But you also want to plan on friends coming to check out your bees, right? So like I said, if you can meet some other local beekeepers, they won't only be able to offer you knowledge, but sometimes they can offer you help. I had a great bee mentor that got me started, who unfortunately has moved away from my area. But working with other beekeepers, they can also help you when it's time to harvest, things like that. Once you got your bee yard figured out, you got to figure out about storage, people. Because I tell you this, beekeeping is a lot of money. To get started, it's about $500. I got a video on that. I'll link it here, hopefully, on what you need to buy to get started. But you need to think about storage, because most folks might start out with 1 hive or 2 hives. But if you're successful, your bees are going to grow. You're going to need to split your hives eventually, probably, which means you're going to need more equipment. So not only do you need equipment, but you got to figure out where to store it. So I'm not going to open this door too much because it's kind of broken door. But inside this old outhouse that I converted into a little storage shed, that's where I keep some of my beekeeping equipment. Mainly boxes. So it's weatherproof in there basically, but that's where I keep a lot of my boxes. It's a little dark inside the barn, but I'm going to point out where I keep more beekeeping stuff. Honestly, what I need next is a bee shed. So back here, so again, I know it's kind of dark in here. This whole area, inside the freezer as well, it's not a working freezer. This is where I have all of my my pooled frames, my wax frames. These are filled with wax frames. Now in the spring and summer, these will be on my hives. But you got to have a place to store what you're not using in the wintertime. And even in my man shed, I have other bee-related equipment. The man shed's nothing fancy. Looks a little redneck because it is. But down in that red shed is my man shed. where I do woodworking, but I also store some beekeeping stuff there for candle making. What else I got in there these days? Just some frames I need to assemble. So I'll tell you this, that's a problem I'm having, is storage of all of my equipment. So if you're living in a place where you don't have storage, you got to figure that out, because you're going to have more equipment than you think you're going to have. I'm just going to check on our horses as I'm sharing some info, because I had to turn on their water for them and just checking to see if that trough is filled or not. Something else you got to figure out, which helps again if there's a local beekeeping club or a bee friend. How are you going to extract honey, okay? Because that's kind of the whole point for most of us, is to get honey, right? Now I get wax and a little bit of propolis, and I get joy from raising the bees and such, but figuring out how you're going to extract honey, right? You can do the old time, I guess, method where you're ruining the honeycomb, where you're pushing it through like a strainer or something, the strain method. But really most folks use extractors, and even a basic extractor, which is what I have, is about $150. So you got to start thinking, okay, my end game is honey. How am I going to harvest that honey, extract it, and then also, are you going to be selling it? That's what I do these days, is I sell honey on the side. So where are some places to go and sell honey? And if you're not a beekeeper, but you want to be a beekeeper, and it may not be coming up for the next year or two, you're planning, figuring stuff out, the least you should be doing is supporting local beekeepers, okay? Beekeeping, as you'll find out, is not a cheap hobby. And for some, I know it's a business. For me, it's a passionate hobby. But if you want to be a beekeeper, but you're not there yet, supporting us other local beekeepers is a great way to help, because honey you buy in the store is not necessarily real honey, and it's probably not local honey. So the last thing I want to talk about, tip, hint, where are you going to get bees, okay? That's a big decision. Where are you going to get bees? These days, there's lots and lots of options. There's lots of companies, corporations even, that sell bees. There's bee farms. You can get a package or a nuke. A package is about 3 pounds of bees usually, and a mated queen. And the package workers aren't yet bonded to that queen and her pheromones. But usually things work out. You can also get a nuke, which is basically a mini hive. Queen's already laying eggs. There's bees of all ages in that nuke. The benefit of that is that it's a proven queen. It's already going, more expensive. Either way, it's difficult sometimes to get honey your first year. So you don't want to plan on that. Maybe, I don't know, 40% of the time on a first year hive, you can get honey on a 100% fresh hive, but it's not something to really plan on, I guess. So, right, there's the package and nuke option. You want to get bees as local to you as possible if you can. So like a lot of northern beekeepers are probably getting bees from the south that aren't acclimated to your region. So it's tough. Sometimes you can find a local beekeeper that has a little bit of success and can sell a hive or two. That's actually what I did last year. I sold a hive to a buddy of mine because I just didn't want to buy more equipment and have more bees. You can also catch a swarm, and I know a lot of people talk about that's a great way to get started. I've caught a few swarms, but I don't think it's a great way to get started, because if you really want to be a beekeeper, you're resting everything on catching a swarm. And especially if you don't have a lot of bee knowledge, catching a swarm can be a little scary. If you don't know what you're doing, it's a little nerve-wracking for most. And it's not a great way to start beekeeping, at least I think, because if you don't catch a swarm, most folks, swarm season is about 2 to 3 months in the spring. And if you don't get a swarm, then you're not going to beekeep that year. Now, I think swarms are great to expand your knowledge, expand your hive. Sometimes you get local genetics. Sometimes it's a neighbor's bees that they just bought from Florida or somewhere. But I wouldn't recommend starting beekeeping by hoping to get a swarm. People do, and it's free bees, but if you really want to get into beekeeping, you may have to invest that money to get your bee package. Well, I hope this has been helpful. I'm trying to give you some tips, things you should do before you become a beekeeper. This is for those future beekeepers out there that really want to start. And I'm hoping some of this knowledge is going to help you out to be more successful. And good luck.